I, Michael Richard Pence, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Mike Pence stood beside Donald Trump as loyal lieutenant and right-hand man.
Mike, will you be my running mate?
We're going to re-elect President Donald Trump for 4 more years.
January 6th divided them.
I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so.
It's time to evacuate so we can secure the members on the other side. Copy.
And today, Pence's road back to the White House requires beating his old boss.
I have faith that Republican voters will once again choose the good way, the way of conservative values and limited government.
But Pence says it's about more than that. For Mike Pence, 2024 is a once-in-a-lifetime battle for the soul of the Republican Party.
I believe I'm the most qualified, the most consistent, traditional conservative in this race.
Good evening from NewsNation headquarters in Chicago, and welcome to the Mike Pence Town Hall on NewsNation. I'm Leland Vittert, and tonight, voters will get to ask the former governor turned vice president and now presidential candidate about the issues that matter most to them, rather than stale questions from inside the Washington Beltway. In addition to you at home, we are joined by live studio audiences at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa. You can see them on the screen, and here in Chicago. And we encourage you at home to share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag #PenceTownHall. The audience members here have agreed to keep their reactions to a minimum so we can get to more questions, except for right now, when we welcome the 48th Vice President of the United States and presidential candidate, Mike Pence.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leland.
Mr. Vice President, great to have you with us. Mr. Pence agreed to this evening's event without preconditions and without seeing the questions or picking the audience members. NewsNation brought together open-minded voters interested in hearing your ideas for our country at this time. So we begin with a show of hands. How many of you plan to vote or caucus in the Republican primary? All right, there we go. How many of you have yet to decide, or are persuadable, you might say, in your primary choice? Almost everybody. How many of you right now would consider voting for Mr. Pence? We'll wait for Iowa there. We begin with breaking news tonight that will affect millions of Americans. It is 9 p.m. Eastern right now. Tomorrow at midnight, 150,000 United Auto workers say they will walk off the job of the big 3 automakers. A strike will shut down parts suppliers across the heartland and potentially devastate Midwest's economy. It is fragile at this time. You're looking at live pictures of Detroit right now. President Biden said last week he did not think a strike would happen. That appears almost certain at this point, based on late-breaking news this evening. Hundreds of thousands of families tonight are worried, and they have reasons to be. We have a question from one of those workers about to hit the picket line in Michigan.
Hello, Mr. Pence. I'm Charles Wade out of UAW Local 900, Wayne, Michigan. I build the Ford Bronco and the Ranger. And my question is, if you are elected as president, will you support the UAW worker and the auto worker and labor in its whole?
Well, thank you, Charles. Thank you for the question. It's such an important one. And Leland, I want to thank you and NewsNation and everyone that's made time to be a part of this town hall this evening. It's an honor to be with you all. Charles, I will tell you that you're talking to somebody who comes from a heartland state. We're gathered here in Chicago tonight, but I'm from Indiana. We know just a little bit about the auto industry, and we take great pride in the role that our state, that your state in Michigan, and auto workers have played in the life of this nation. But I would expect that the prospect of a strike among auto workers is just one other symptom of the failure of Bidenomics in this country. You know, I'm running for president because I think this country is in a lot of trouble. I mean, from the very outset of this administration, Joe Biden launched a gusher of spending that created the worst inflation in 40 years. I mean, families are struggling. Wages have fallen behind, aren't keeping up every day. And I would expect that the negotiations between the UAW and our major auto workers is simply a reflection of the fact that families are hurting in this economy. I've got a plan to defeat inflation. MikePence2024.com. It's a way we can rein in government spending. We can get the Federal Reserve back to worrying about protecting the value of the dollar in our pocketbook. And if I'm president of the United States, I'm also going to end the war on energy. We're going to unleash American energy because, as we learned in the news this morning, inflation is starting to kick back up, Leland, 3.7%. We've experienced 16.6% inflation since the time that we left office. And the reality is that the cost of living has risen for every American, not just auto workers, but every worker. So I think the key is tackling inflation, unleashing this American energy industry, and that's how we'll bring this economy back, and not just for auto workers, but for every American working family. And that's what I'll bring to the presidency of the United States.
I appreciate that. We're going to get to inflation and to the issues of energy in a minute specifically. But back now, just for a second, to Charles. He worked an important line there about standing up for labor. And conceivably, at a time when you have 150,000 Americans about to walk the picket line and shut down maybe 1 million more jobs that are connected to the auto industry, the President of the United States would be doing a lot over these next 24 hours. Specifically, if you were president right now, what would you be doing?
Well, if I was president of the United States, I'd be sitting people down. I'd be sitting down with the management of the auto companies that I got to know more than a little bit back when I was vice president, when I was governor of Indiana. And I'd be sitting down with the UAW and figuring out how we can turn the corner on this thing. But I really do believe, Leland, at the end of the day, this is not just one more contract dispute between auto workers and the big three and automakers in this country. I think it is symptomatic of the failed policies of the Biden administration. And even though Joe Biden is spending a lot of time and millions of dollars on television telling us that Bidenomics is working, the American people know better.
Well,
I'm going to focus on the root cause and get this economy moving again. But I promise you, if I'm president of the United States, we'll be sitting people down. We'll be figuring out how we can resolve these issues and move our economy and our communities forward.
All right. You noted, as someone from a small town in Indiana, that you understand the unique blessings, unique challenges that face American farmers. You and I have talked about that before. At NewsNation, we work hard to cover rural America. Last year, we got a lot of feedback from our documentary Harvest that focuses on challenges facing American farmers. Of course, those challenges have only gotten worse in places like Indiana and Iowa, especially as you've talked about, inflation has hit farmers especially hard. Your path to the Republican nomination runs through Iowa. The caucuses right now are 124 days away. Our next question comes from Jacob. He's a gas station clerk in Iowa who will be voting in his very first presidential election next year. And as you can tell, is quite interested in the process. Hi, Jacob.
Hello, Mr. Pence. I work at a gas station here in Iowa, and all I see is that the prices are going up. What are you going to do to get the cost of gas and food down?
Well, Jacob, I woke up in Iowa this morning, so thanks for joining us and all of you that are gathered there. You may not know, I grew up in a gas station family, Jacob. I was a gas station attendant for 5 years, helped pay my way through college. And, I never thought I'd live to see the day that we saw $2 a gallon gas again, but we did during our administration because we unleashed American energy. We allowed for the responsible development of oil and natural gas on public lands. And frankly, as we see gasoline prices here in Chicago, I checked today that they're well over $4 a gallon. Gasoline prices overall nationally are up 60% since we left office. We're experiencing the results of Joe Biden's war on energy. I mean, from day one of this administration, Jacob, Joe Biden shut down the Keystone and Dakota pipelines. They've offlined millions of acres of federal lands for energy development. And just last week, they announced millions more acres in Alaska that they're going to shut down for energy development. All the while, we're going hat in hand to places like Saudi Arabia and even Venezuela asking if we can buy their oil. You know, I'm an all of the above energy guy. I believe in oil and coal and natural gas. I believe in all of our renewables, strong supporter of ethanol in Iowa. But look, the first thing I'm going to do on day one of any administration that I lead is end this war on energy and give the American people once again full access to all of the natural resources that we have in this land. That's how we'll bring down the cost of gasoline at the pump. That's how we bring down the cost of energy. That's also how we tackle inflation, because we all know energy prices are a leading driver of inflation in this country.
All right, Jacob, thank you very much. We'll get back to Iowa in a minute. You noted we've just gotten some increased numbers again today that show that inflation is not under control. Economists will say that when you look at the root causes of inflation, it is an enormous amount of government spending as it related and began with the pandemic. That started with the Trump-Pence administration, $3.4 trillion of spending during the Trump-Pence administration that you supported. Does your former administration bear any responsibility for the inflation that is existing today because of that spending?
Well, it didn't exist during our administration, Leland. Inflation was at a very reasonable pace during the 4 years of the Trump-Pence administration. It wasn't until Joe Biden became president with that Democrat Congress that they passed a $2 trillion spending bill, all in the name of COVID, that was completely unnecessary. I got to tell you.
So you're okay with the $3.4 trillion you spent?
No, I didn't say I was.
Okay.
You know, I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. But
okay.
People that know my record in Congress and as governor know I'm a pretty tight-fisted fiscal conservative. I think we could have done a better job controlling domestic spending in this country. Now, I stand by what we did to rebuild our military after years of reckless budget cutbacks under the Obama administration that were harming our military readiness and preparedness. And frankly, the money that we spent during COVID for families and for businesses to see us through the worst pandemic in 100 years, I thought was necessary. But in between those two things, I'll stipulate to that we could have done a better job. But on this inflation point, which is what you asked me about, I mean, the inflation started after Joe Biden signed that $2 trillion spending bill. Economists on the left and the right concede that lit the pilot light on the worst inflation in 40 years. For heaven's sakes, a dozen eggs cost 50% more than it did the day we left office. Families are hurting at the price, not just at the pump, but at the grocery store. We'll tackle inflation by putting our fiscal house in order.
All right. Mr. Vice President, your wife of 33 years, former Second Lady, Karen Pence, is here with us. Nice to see you, ma'am. Thank you. Your marriage has been a focus of a lot of coverage over the years, shall we say. Jacob is with us now, a 22-year-old political consultant here in Chicago, and has a question about marriage in America and the state of it.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Vice President. So my question is, over 50% of marriages end in divorce, and more children than ever are being raised in single-family households. In a hypothetical Pence administration, what would you do to restore the nuclear family and help keep families together?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a wonderful one. And just so we don't get fact-checked on NewsNation tonight, I've been married to this incredible woman for 38 years.
Oh, boy.
And she was the best second lady the United States of America has ever had. And I'm incredibly proud of her. Proud of our kids, all of whom...
The math error is ours, sir.
No, I'm kidding you. I'm just having fun with you, Leland. Look, I think you put your finger on a real issue in America today, and I think we ought to be thinking real hard about how we strengthen families in this country and how we make it more possible for more families to live on one income. Now, inflation is waging war on that all by itself today. But if I'm president of the United States, what I want to do is take a hard look at that tax code. You know, we worked to end the marriage penalty back when I was in Congress, and we worked to keep the marriage penalty at bay when I was your vice president. But I'd actually like to think more boldly about that. I think about for families where one of the spouses would like to stay home for a time with those kids, I'd like to make it more possible for people to be able to do that. But I got to tell you, I just finished a book with my daughter, who's a writer, and an accomplished author in her own right. And the title of the book is Go Home for Dinner, because I hope if I'm President of the United States, I'd have the opportunity to remind people that, as Ronald Reagan said, that all great change in America begins at the dinner table. And that if we can just encourage families to take time for one another, to go home for dinner, to spend time with one another, that as the American family strengthens, strong families make strong communities make a strong nation. So we'll work hard to both encourage and inspire, but also find ways to support two-parent families in America. They're the wellspring of our strength.
Something to really admire, and you and I have talked about this in the past, is the example you provide in your marriage, and you practice what you preach. There's no question about that. But your marriage and your discussion of it and how you conduct yourself has been a source of criticism by the left in the past. The facts are it has been. Would you consider a woman as a vice president?
Well, Leland, when I was governor of Indiana, my first lieutenant governor was a woman, an accomplished leader from the state legislature who went on the years since to lead the largest community college system in America. So you better believe it. But if I'm the Republican nominee, I don't want to get ahead of things, but I promise you, we're going to find that person who is the best qualified, the best prepared, and the most committed to the agenda that we felt called to advance, which is that traditional conservative agenda of a strong defense, limited government, fiscal responsibility, the right to life, and traditional values. So I'd be looking for agreement on those core values, but looking for a person of great character who, in the event that history called, would be able to step in and assume those duties.
I thought you were going to mention Kim Reynolds' name, but I didn't know.
Okay. I guarantee you we'll consider Kim Reynolds.
One of the things
Iowa's got an outstanding governor who couldn't be more proud of her.
One of the things that has been said about how you conduct your personal life is you will not eat alone or meet alone with a woman. One of the hallmarks of your presidency, and one of the things that was reported on a lot, was your private lunches one-on-one with Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. How would that work out if you had a female vice president?
Well, that's a very clever question. It really is. Let me say, it's a promise my wife and I made to one another. I didn't think it was particularly controversial. When I was first elected to Congress, I did an interview about the fact that we kept our family close in public service. Somebody asked us about some of the promises we'd made to one another, and I remember I said, well, I'd promised her that I wouldn't dine alone with a woman that was not my wife. And wasn't very controversial until after I became vice president. Somebody unearthed that quote, and it became quite an issue.
You think it's an unfair criticism?
Look, I respect the way anybody manages their marriage, and I never want to feel like I'm imposing my values on anybody. But I have to tell you, what we were so moved by was the outpouring of support across the country, as some on the liberal left in the media found a way to kind of criticize us for putting that priority on our marriage. But then I remember the New York Times finally did a poll where they found out that more than 60% of married couples actually thought that was a pretty good idea. And so everybody kind of dropped it. And in the wake of those tragic circumstances around the Me Too movement, it seemed to go away. But I must tell you, however it plays in public, there's no greater blessing in my life other than my faith in Jesus Christ and the marriage that I have with this incredible woman and the blessings of our family. We'll always put them first, whatever it means or whatever criticism comes.
We did not have you quoting New York Times polling on our bingo card for the first block of this town hall. We appreciate it. There's a lot more audience questions to get to, both here in Chicago and also in Des Moines, Iowa. You, sir, have said that Donald Trump is unfit to serve as president. How does the former vice president square that with his pledge to support whoever is the Republican nominee? That when we come back. Plus, how would President Pence deal with the trans issue and the Republican war on woke in our schools? glad to have you all with us. We've been on the campaign trail with you, and you have some supporters, obviously, that we've met in Iowa and other states, and some others perhaps feel differently, and I think you experienced one of those earlier this week. Take a look.
We need to get the out of our country and get the out of Iowa.
I'm going to put him down as a maybe.
It was maybe just a little too optimistic.
I thought he sounded kind of undecided.
Okay, well,
Actually,
look, there's always hope. That's a good thing.
but I always tell my kids, that's what freedom sounds like.
That's a good point. Look,
When you're out there on the campaign trail, people can tell you they agree with you. They can tell you they disagree with you. It's just a privilege for us to be out there.
we've got a lot of viewer questions to get to. One thing we heard from a lot of you about on the campaign trail, and as we have covered these stories across the country, is education. Obviously, it was a deciding factor in the Virginia governor's race, which brings us to our next question from Kristen. She's a substitute teacher here in Tinley Park, Illinois.
Great.
Good evening, Mr. Vice President. As someone who has worked in education and as an expecting mom, I'm concerned about the sex education curriculum being implemented in many school districts in Illinois and around the country. With American students already being behind in core subjects, what could and would you do at the federal level to reform our education system, which is keeping important information about students from their parents?
Well, first off, let me congratulate you on your career in education. I've been married to a school teacher, and I said for 38 years. She spent 30 years in the classroom, public and private. We have great regard for your calling and wish you every blessing in that big news that's coming for you. So let me start there. I think first and foremost, we got to recognize that there's a radical gender ideology that's taken hold in many of our schools around the country. And I actually got involved. The folks that are joining us from Iowa know this story. The Linn-Mar Community Schools in Iowa. Here was the policy. You had to have a note from your parents to get a Tylenol from the school nurse, but you could get a gender transition plan from the health department at the Linn-Mar schools without ever telling your family. Now, that's not bad policy, that's crazy. And I say that not as a former vice president, I say it as a father and as a grandfather. It's just totally unacceptable. And we've got to protect our kids from this radical gender ideology. And I've made it very clear, as President of the United States, I will seek measures, if needs be nationally, to ban chemical or surgical transition procedures on anyone under the age of 18. We just got to protect our kids from this. And we've got to give parents the right to choose where their kids go to school, so that they're not subject to the liberal ideology that we've seen take hold in many public schools. In Iowa, for instance, they recently passed universal school choice, and I commend your governor and your state legislature for doing that. So I think we empower parents to choose where their kids go to school. I think all of our schools are going to get better because they become more accountable. In America, we believe in competition. Competition makes everybody better, and that's what school choice does. But finally, with regard to the federal level, I want to tell you, one of the things I'm proposing is I think we need to shut down the Federal Department of Education and send all that money back to the states, because I believe that education is a state and a local function. It's just too important to have Washington, D.C. meddling. And a lot of people don't know that, Leland, that the Federal Department of Education was President Jimmy Carter's idea. It didn't exist before. But under our Constitution, it's very clear all the way through the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights that the powers not delegated to federal government are reserved to the states. And I think when you're talking about education, when you're talking about public safety, government that governs least governs best. And so I want to see those funds go back to the states. I want state-based reform. I'm going to promote educational choice in every state in the country. But first and foremost, we're going to protect our kids from that radical gender ideology that's taken hold in too many public schools.
All right, Kristen, congratulations. Thank you for joining us. We've got Melissa McAllister. She's a professor of social work in Iowa who's joining us, who I understand may have a little bit of a different view on this, but we wanted to let her ask you a question.
Good evening, Vice President. I am an LGBTQ member, and I have trans individuals in my family. Recent anti-LGBTQ bills have been signed into law all around this United States, including here in Iowa. So far in 2023, 15 transgender individuals and gender nonconforming people have been murdered. The vast majority of those people have been Black and Latinx transgender women. It is very hard for me to ask these questions after just hearing what I heard. What is your policy plan to protect the transgender community, specifically Black and brown trans women, from historically high levels of violence?
Well, Melissa, let me say, I'm deeply grieved to hear about those tragic circumstances. And I hear your heart. And I'm moved by your emotion. I truly am. Look, if I'm president of the United States, I'm going to see to the protection of every American and the rights of every American. But whether that squares with my values or not, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. I have a particular view of these matters, and you have a different view of those, perhaps. But I want you to know I believe in the freedom of religion. I believe in the freedom of conscience. I believe in the right of every American to live, to work, to worship according to the dictates of their conscience, and I'll respect that. But I hope you also hear my heart on this. For me, what adults do in their lives, decisions that they make, including transgender adults, is one thing. But for kids under the age of 18, there's a reason why we don't let you drive till you're 16. The state of Indiana, you can't get a tattoo until after you're 18. You can't drink until after you're 21. That's because we understand that kids don't fully understand the consequences of their actions. And so I hope you hear in my strong sentiment on the gender ideology that's being taught and has been taught in some elementary schools and promoted among many of our kids, that when it comes to surgical or chemical procedures, I really believe that we've got to protect our kids from decisions that will affect them the balance of their lives, while at the same time saying that adults can make decisions according to the dictates of their own conscience. And I want you to know, whether I agree with everything anyone in this country believes, that anybody that knows our family knows we love everybody. I believe in treating others the way I want to be treated. And I hope you hear my heart on that as well.
Melissa, do you understand the Vice President's idea that there is a difference between how adults conduct their lives and make decisions and that of how kids do?
Absolutely. I'm a social worker. I've been in this profession for 25 years. I've worked with kids most of my profession. I started an LGBTQ youth program in my own hometown. I started one in Terre Haute, Indiana, where I was threatened with KKK, and X is on my doorstep, and that was in 2020. I have worked with kids as young as 5 years old that have gender nonconforming and identities that are transgender, and I've raised one. And so to hear somebody tell me that it's not okay for young children to make decisions about their gender identity and to ask their school officials for support, protection, and help is appalling.
Melissa, thank you very much.
Especially here in Linn-Mar. Thank you, Linn-Mar.
Melissa, thank you. We appreciate the question. Mr. Vice President, just to follow up on that, is there a way to have a situation where kids who have some real challenges or questions and view life in different ways, as Melissa indicated, can get help and their parents can get help for them without necessarily going all the way in these what you would call extreme procedures?
Look, I would just tell you, and having been married to an elementary school teacher all these years, I just think we got to protect our kids. I really do, and I'm saddened by the experiences that she recounts.
Yeah.
I really am. I don't think anyone should ever be mistreated or harassed or discriminated against because of who they are, or what they believe, or their race or creed or color. And anybody that knows me knows that's true. But I think at the end of the day, look, the idea that we are telling young, impressionable kids that little boys that they can become girls, or little girls that they can become boys, I just think is wrong. And I would hope that Melissa would hear my heart, that I'd like to put my arm around any one of those young people and just say, we love you, but wait. Wait until you reach an age of majority, wait until you have a better idea of who you are, and then live the life that you want to live in this free country.
Fair enough. Another issue that's been quite litigated, shall we say, and there have been a lot of discussions, this is your views on abortion and where they are on the Republican Party. I won't ask you about those. It's been a well-traveled path. But there's been intense debate in Washington and in the United States and among Republicans over Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville's holding up of military promotions over the Pentagon policy that allows service women to travel out of state and to help them travel out of state to get abortions. 7 secretaries of defense, former secretaries of defense, say Tuberville is single-handedly crippling our military. Should Tuberville stand down?
No, the Pentagon should stand down. What are we using taxpayer dollars at the Pentagon for to undermine pro-life laws in states around the country? I mean, look, I'm pro-life. I don't apologize for it. I'm incredibly proud to have played a role in the administration that appointed 3 of the justices that gave America a new beginning for life. And now states around the country are advancing protections for the unborn. And if I'm president of the United States, I've made it clear that I'll be a champion for the right to life from the Oval Office. But the very idea that the generals at the Pentagon on some liberal Democrat agenda are using taxpayer dollars to undermine state laws for the protecting unborn children is just wrong. I mean, there's no restriction on the ability. Look, we've got, our son's a captain in the Marine Corps. My son-in-law is a lieutenant in the Navy. There's no restriction on the ability of service members to take leave, travel wherever they want to travel. We have freedom of travel in this country. But the idea of using taxpayer dollars to underwrite that and a means of undermining the laws of particular jurisdictions is wrong. I commend Senator Tuberville. And rather than asking him to stand down, I ask the Pentagon to stand down. I promise you, if I'm president of the United States, we're going to get all this woke business out of the Pentagon. We're going to have a Secretary of Defense. We're going to have a Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that focuses on the mission of the United States military, which is preparedness and ensuring that they can defend this nation and defend our interests around the world.
So just want to understand, and you said no, Senator Tuberville shouldn't stand down. If, as you're trying to get, as you said, all the woke business out of the Pentagon, and there is a Democratic senator who holds up military promotions because they want woke business, to use your term, in the Pentagon, what would be your response?
I'd take that to the American people. I'd say you got some Democrat. You mean if I'm president?
Yeah.
I mean, I like the premise of that question a lot, Leland. Really
there'll be more. Don't worry. That's sort of what this is about.
If I'm president of the United States, some liberal Democrat says, "Hey, I'm going to hold up, promotions in the military unless you advance some liberal social agenda at the Pentagon." I'd go to the American people and see what they think about that. I mean, the truth is, Senator Tuberville is taking a stand, defending the rights of millions, tens of millions of pro-life tax-paying Americans to say, look, we are happy to invest in our national defense. We are happy to invest, especially in our military personnel. But using taxpayer dollars for the military to advance a social agenda, that's not what it's there for, and I'd take that to the country.
We talked at the beginning of this. You brought up that COVID, certainly no one thought it would define the end of the Trump-Pence administration. It is now once again becoming an issue in America. Dale Rasco, 60-year-old lawyer, Rolling Meadows, Illinois, is with us now with a question about COVID in your time in the White House. Dale?
Hi, Mr. Vice President. It's a pleasure to meet you. In connection, my question is has to do with the pandemic that began in 2020 and your role as the head of the coronavirus task force. So, in connection with your role as the head of the coronavirus task force, what are the three most important things that you would have done differently?
Well, I don't know if it's just three, Dale. I mean, look, the president appointed that task force about right at the end of 2019. By the end of February, we hadn't had a single fatality in the country yet, but we knew something was coming. He asked me at the end of February to lead the task force. I immediately added the Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Kudlow, our chief economist, to the task force because I knew there'd be things we'd have to do. We'd have to ask American businesses and the American people to do, but the focus needed to be on how we get our economy moving as quickly as possible and we make decisions necessary that would save lives, but also avoid as much dislocation as we could. But I will tell you that I have three big takeaways from that. Number one is China's responsible for the COVID pandemic, and China needs to be held accountable. Secondly, I think Operation Warp Speed was a medical miracle. I'm incredibly proud of the fact that with American innovation, we managed to develop 3 safe and effective vaccines in 9 months. Vaccines usually take 3 to 5 years to approve. And I believe we saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But it should have never been mandated. I mean, it was astonishing to me that when the Biden administration came in, they largely abandoned the innovation that we'd done on testing. They didn't pay any attention to supplies. They didn't develop therapeutics. They put all of their eggs in one basket, and it was vaccines. And then when Americans were exercising their freedom to not take vaccines, they mandated them. Fortunately, the Supreme Court's undone most of that. And we finally got the vaccine mandate off men and women in our military. But healthcare workers today still face a vaccine mandate, which I think is unconscionable. So vaccines should have never been mandated. And lastly, schools should have never been closed. And our administration never advocated that schools be closed. It's widely misunderstood. The truth of the matter is that in the early days, we knew that if what was happening in New York and New Jersey and in Detroit and in Seattle and New Orleans was in every city in the country, that our healthcare system would be overwhelmed. And it was the reason why our medical experts said, hey, we've got to take a pause in the economy. They first started with 15 days to slow the spread, and then it went on another month. But the idea was that we wanted the economy essentially to take a knee while we spun up supplies and materials and testing from literally from a standing start. And we delivered billions of supplies and millions of tests around the country. But frankly, the temporary measures in that spring were never intended to be permanent. What we saw was governors around the country, mayors like here in Chicago, that took those temporary measures that were designed to make sure we didn't run out of supplies and our hospitals weren't overwhelmed, and they turned them into policy, like somehow you could, as Joe Biden said throughout the campaign, he was going to defeat COVID. We weren't going to defeat COVID. You just prepare and be able to deal with it and make sure people get the kind of health care services that we'd want any member of our family to have. And so for me, those are the three big takeaways. I think I've come to the conclusion it did come from a Chinese lab. We got to hold China accountable for that. And secondly, we got to make sure vaccines are never mandated on any Americans in a circumstance like this. And we got to never, ever close our schools again in the face of a pandemic that we dealt with. It's just done too much harm to our kids. And it never should have happened.
Dale, when you asked the question I just had, what would you have done differently? One of the things that Ron DeSantis said he would have done differently is fire Anthony Fauci, as he was continuing to advocate for the things that you said and you said were a mistake. Was continuing to allow him to have that role and be such a vocal part of the coronavirus task force a mistake?
Well, later in the year, it may well have been, but it wasn't my call. President Trump appointed Dr. Fauci to the task force, and Dr. Fauci, I will tell you, in the early days, and I wrote about this in my book, I felt like he stayed in his lane. He gave us medical advice, but he understood that we ultimately would have to make decisions on the broader interests of the country, including economic decisions. But frankly, when Joe Biden started announcing in his campaign that he was going to put Dr. Fauci in charge of the entire national response, which he ultimately did after he took office, things seemed to change. And we saw heavy-handed Democrat governors and heavy-handed Democrat mayors that were pointing to his rhetoric and using that to promote lockdowns around the country. But I'd leave that to the judgment of history. But the team that I was given on that task force, I did my level best, beginning with a little bit of time in prayer to save American lives. We focused on making sure that the American people had the resources that they needed to meet that moment. While we can learn an awful lot from it, and I think we should, Dale, I'm incredibly proud of what the American people accomplished during the worst pandemic in 100 years.
You called the vaccines an American miracle, and we led the world in that, and as you said, saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. They have now become incredibly political. Just the concept of vaccines, and maybe it's because there was mandates surrounding them. The CDC just told everyone to get a booster today. Is that something that you're going to do?
Well, I'm a little concerned about reading press accounts that this booster hasn't been subject to tests that are common for approving medicines and vaccines. And so I've read that. I'm troubled by that. I want to listen very carefully to that. But I do think the reason why this has become political is because it was mandated on the American people. I mean, and I want to assure all of you, if we'd have gotten 4 more years, there'd have never been a vaccine mandate. It was just never going to happen.
You think more people would have gotten it had there not been a mandate?
I have a sense that it just became political. Of course,
everything needs to become political now.
But it was also political. I remember in the vice presidential debate with now Vice President Kamala Harris, where she said that if a vaccine was developed under the Trump administration, she wouldn't take it. And I called her out. I said, you got to stop playing politics with people's lives. I mean, literally, I grieve for every family, including many that might be looking on tonight, who lost a loved one to the COVID pandemic. And I want to tell you, you'll always be on our hearts. But the fact is, this is a free country. And what the Biden administration did, resulted in literally, and I say this with sadness, we lost more Americans in their first year with COVID, when they had all the tools, all the supplies, all the testing, all the therapeutics, and the vaccines, than we lost in our first year with COVID, when we started with none of those things.
It's a good place to leave it. We got a lot more questions to get to, but your point's well made, sir. When we come back, Mike Pence's plan to take the Republican Party back from Donald Trump, plus, believe it or not, UFOs have come back into the news today. The vice president, of course, had access to all of our nation's secrets. We might ask, it might come up, what does the former vice president know about life beyond the stars? He was here on this stage just a couple of weeks ago, and Ramaswamy made his pitch for a younger Republican movement. He said that seasoned politicians such as yourself, and I know you have a few thoughts on that, are not able to lead another revolution. We have a question about that from Aaron, 45-year-old lifelong Republican here in Chicago. Aaron, lifelong Republican in Chicago is a lonely place to be, but we're glad you're here.
It's like being the tallest midget in the room. Mr. Pence, you were a former congressman. a governor, and recently vice president with decades-long career in politics. How does it make you feel that a novice like Vivek Ramaswamy is challenging you in many cases ahead of you in regional and national polls? And secondary, what do you think that says about the current state of the Republican Party?
Well, look, I have a lot of respect for everybody that was on that debate stage a couple of weeks ago, and I'm looking forward to being back on it myself in a couple of weeks. Look, I think we're involved in a very important debate about the future of the Republican Party and about the future of the country. I mean, I'm a conservative. I'm not in a bad mood about it, okay? But I believe in a strong national defense, American leadership in the world. I believe in limited government, fiscal responsibility, and balanced budgets. I believe in the right to life and traditional moral values. But frankly, I look at my competitors, my former running mate, others that have stepped forward, including my friend Vivek, who I met several years ago. And I hear them walking away from some of those same timeless conservative principles. I mean, they're talking about walking away from American leadership in the world stage and practicing appeasement with regard to Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Joe Biden's policy on the national debt is insolvency. And frankly, my former running mate and others in this field's policy is identical. They won't even talk about reforming some of the long-term programs that really threaten the vitality of our economy for years to come. And finally, on the right to life, you know, as I said, I'm pro-life. I don't apologize for it. But my former running mate and virtually everyone else on that stage wants to relegate the question of life to states only. But I don't think the Supreme Court returned the question of abortion to the states only. They returned it to the states and the American people. The American people elect presidents. They elect senators. They elect congressmen. And I believe the time has come for us to create a minimum national standard to protect unborn children from the moment that they can feel pain, even while I'll champion greater protections for the unborn around the country. So for me, it's not so much about personalities as it is about philosophy. And I really believe, not just because it's a winning agenda, an agenda over the last 50 years that actually has delivered majorities for our party, but more importantly, a commitment to those timeless American ideals and principles has made America stronger and more prosperous in years past, and I know it will again.
All right, Aaron, thank you very much for your question. We quite appreciate it. You can't deny the Republican Party's change. You talked a little bit about personality and sort of this difference in style here. Mitt Romney, who clearly has had a long career in the Republican Party, said today that he is not running for re-election. He's 75 years old. In his farewell address press conference, he said, "You have no chance to win the nomination and that you are running to, quote, repair your legacy," in his words. Your response?
I'm running for president of the United States because I think this country's in a lot of trouble. And I'm running to win. I'm running to win the Republican nomination, and I'm running to win a better future for American families that are struggling under the failed policies of the Biden administration at home and abroad. So look, I'll leave Senator Romney to his opinions. But people who know me know I'm in it to win it, and not a victory for me. You know, I've been blessed as my years as a leader in the Congress. I was a conservative leader in Congress before it was cool. I was a governor of a state that balanced budgets and cut taxes and expanded educational choice and stood for traditional values. And then I was vice president in a consequential administration that left America stronger and more prosperous than ever before. I've been blessed. I've had incredible opportunities. But when I looked at the range of experiences that I've had, and we concluded after much prayer and deliberation that I am in fact the most qualified, the most tested, the most consistent conservative running for the Republican nomination, I knew that we just had to step forward. You know, I just couldn't sit this one out. I was raised to believe to whom much is given, much will be required. And we're stepping forward not to preserve some legacy, not to make some point, but because I believe that these ideals that I just talked about, these principles that have defined our movement over the last 50 years, and frankly, I believe have been at the heart of American prosperity and strength for generations, are the pathway forward to restoring our country.
I remember covering you as a member of Congress as well and knew about you. And your principles haven't changed. Your ideas haven't changed over time, which cannot be said about so many. In Washington, you brought up your former boss, who is also running for president. Tammy, who's a retired dental hygienist, served in the Army, is joining us from Des Moines with a question about that. Hi, Tammy.
Good evening, Vice President Pence.
Hi,
As
Tammy.
Vice President, you are very in sync with Trump's policies, which haven't really changed at all. Why are you challenging him now?
Tammy, I think it's such a great question, and I really appreciate you asking. You know, in 2016, Donald Trump, who had a very diverse political background, supported Republicans and Democrats over the course of his life. He promised to govern as a conservative. And many people have told me that when they saw me selected as his vice president, someone that had been in the conservative movement my entire adult life, they thought it was evidence of that. And I will tell you, Tammy, we did govern as conservatives. I mean, you look at that record of rebuilding the military, standing with our allies, standing up to our enemies. When you look at a record of tax cuts and rolling back regulation and unleashing American energy, achieving energy independence for the first time in 75 years. And when you look at those conservatives appointed to our courts at every level, we governed as conservatives, and I'm proud of it. But I stand before you today because the former president and frankly others in this field are walking away from many of those principles where we stood strong on the world stage, where we demonstrated a willingness to use American power to stand with our allies. I hear the former president now shying away from American leadership on the world stage, and I hear others in this race. The governor of Florida says that Ukraine is a territorial dispute. My friend Vivek actually said that we have no national interests there. You know, what we showed is that we can achieve peace through strength. Vladimir Putin didn't even attempt to redraw international lines by force when we were in office because he witnessed us building up our military. He saw us unleash our armed forces to take down the ISIS caliphate and their leader. He saw us use cruise missiles on 2 different occasions to fire into Syria when they used chemical weapons. But I hear the former president and others shying away, saying that we've got problems here at home, as though we can't solve our problems here at home and be the leader of the free world. And frankly, the other big issue, other than life, which I just talked about, is frankly that we have a national debt the size of our nation's economy today. And it really threatens the economic vitality of our country for generations to come. And Joe Biden won't even talk about common sense and compassionate reforms to the entitlement programs that are driving most of that spending. And frankly, the former president has the exact same position as Joe Biden. Well, I believe that we owe it to future generations to put our fiscal house in order, to bring about the kind of reforms that will restore fiscal solvency. I mean, it's that runaway spending in Washington, Tammy, that's driving the inflation, that's raising the cost of living for your family and for mine. And I believe that staying true to that conservative principle, staying true to American leadership in the world, as well as staying true to being a champion for the right to life, is now, it's now in a very real sense, what separates me from my former running mate, and it's much of what brings me to this race today.
You've talked extensively. Tammy has sat down, so we'll come back here in the studio. You've talked extensively and more aggressively about this divide in the Republican Party that you are seeing. You know, Ronald Reagan famously said about being a Democrat, right? He said, you know, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party left me. And you talked about how the Republican Party was changing in very stark terms, St. Anselm's College in New Hampshire last week, an important speech. We'll play a clip.
So today I ask my fellow Republicans this. In the days to come, will we be the party of conservatism, or will we follow the siren song of populism unmoored to conservative principles? The future of this movement and this party belongs to one or the other, not both. That's because the fundamental divide between these two factions is unbridgeable.
All right, so that is the line, an unbridgeable divide in the Republican Party. And you've said that Donald Trump should not be the president again. You're running against him. But you've also promised to support the nominee of the Republican Party. Donald Trump right now is 50 points plus ahead of you right now, or 50 points ahead. As a man who talks so often, and you have, about putting principle ahead of politics, how can both things be true, that he is unfit to serve and that you would support the nominee?
Well, because I intend to be the Republican nominee for President of the United States, and I'm going to vigorously support my candidacy. I promise you that. Look, you can go talk to the people in Iowa who will have the first crack at this thing, the Iowa caucus on January 15. I'm not talking about you, Leland, but a lot of people in the national media want to say this thing's over. Well, I think this thing is in the hands of the American people.
Well, that's why we're having this event with you, because we don't think it's over.
Yeah, I know you don't. I commend you. I commend NewsNation for that. But look, the presidency belongs to the American people. And I believe different times call for different leadership. And I have to tell you, whether it was the 5 stops we had yesterday in Iowa, or when I was in Independence at M's Coffee Company early today, I think the people of Iowa are doing what they always do. They're taking careful consideration of all the candidates, and they're going to shape our national leadership. It's maybe going to be more important than it ever was in the past for Iowa to step forward and start the conversation for a new beginning for the Republican Party and a new beginning for America. But I do want to take issue with something that you said.
Okay.
Look, I'm not...
We're only an hour in. I was expecting this earlier.
Look, I don't... Leland, I think there are leading candidates for the presidency in the Republican Party that have changed. And there are some people who have embraced more populist views that depart from a traditional conservative agenda in our party. But I still believe the vast majority of Republicans believe in a strong defense, American leadership in the world, fiscal responsibility, limited government, traditional values, and the right to life. And that's my message. And it's not just a message. Somebody in the last debate said that positions were poll tested. Right? I don't have a pollster, right? I mean, what you hear me saying is what I've been saying for the last 30 years in my life. It's who I am. I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. I've never changed after I became an adult and found that foundation of faith in my life and found the foundation of a deep conviction in the conservative agenda. I've been about those things. And I still believe that's where most Republican voters are. But we're going to test that theory starting on January 15th at the Iowa caucuses.
All right. Well, so again, and you've said this on the campaign trail, you answered a question to me about this, that there are times that principle is more important than politics. You signed the pledge to get on the debate stage that you would support the eventual nominee. Mm-hmm. Does that mean you would support Donald Trump, and how is that not putting politics ahead of principle?
Well, no, it's about trusting the American people. It's about recognizing that it's a decision that belongs to the American people. And I just trust the American people are going to choose wisely once again. I trust the people of Iowa. I trust the people of New Hampshire and Nevada and South Carolina and all the states that get the first say on this thing. You know, Indiana doesn't get to weigh in until May. I mean, I told people this week in Iowa, I said, because they say, oh, you're Mike Pence, nice to meet you here in Iowa. And I said, if I'd have run into somebody running for president when I was growing up in Indiana, I'd have had a heart attack. But in Iowa, they're pretty used to it, and they take it to heart. And Iowa, New Hampshire, and these early states are going to play a critical role. And I think they're going to step up. They're going to give us new leadership fitted to the times. Because men and women, I will tell you, I've said it once, I'll say it again, this country's in a lot of trouble. Now is not the time for on-the-job training. We don't need a president who's too old. We don't need a president who's too young. I stand before you today and I say with deep humility that I know in my heart of hearts not precisely what the next 18 months looks like for my family. But if you give me the opportunity to be your president, I will know what to do and who to do it with on day one, and we will turn this country around. So help me God.
When you were vice president, the real issue was on the border. It was something that your 2016 campaign really focused on. Whoever is the next president is going to have to deal with a migrant crisis that knows no borders. More of your questions when we come back, including about the migrant crisis here in the United States. Police here in Chicago are quite upset after their police station was turned into a shelter. Take a look.
This is absolutely unacceptable and ridiculous working conditions. This is absolutely unacceptable and ridiculous working conditions. OSHA doesn't want to do anything about it. The mayor's office doesn't want to do anything about it.
All right, that is video provided to us from the Fraternal Order of Police here in Chicago. As you heard, they're a little upset that police stations have been turned into migrant shelters by the mayor here. This is video from inside police stations in Chicago. When you were vice president, obviously much of the discussion of the border crisis revolved around what to do actually with the border itself.
Right.
Fair to say now every city in America is a border city, including here in Chicago. Which brings us to our next question from Colin. He's a financial analyst here in Chicago. A lifelong resident?
Yes, sir.
Lifelong resident. Go ahead.
Welcome to Chicago, Mr. Vice President.
Thanks, Colin.
Chicago is currently experiencing a massive influx of illegal migrants, leading to proposed tent cities and causing a devastating strain on our city's resources and budget. What is your plan to reduce illegal immigration at the southern border?
Colin, we have the worst crisis at our southern border in American history. And it's a man-made crisis. And that man's name is Joe Biden. Under our administration, we had reduced illegal immigration and asylum abuse by 90% by the time we left office. Joe Biden came into office, and on day one, he shut down construction of the border wall. We'd built hundreds of miles of wall. You can go down there today and you'll see what looks like parked railroad trains of girders rusting in the sunshine with large gaps in the wall. Border Patrol agents will tell you the cartels are in operational control of our border today. Then he's been working to undo what was called the Remain in Mexico policy that I negotiated on behalf of the administration with the Mexicans. It said if you're going to apply for asylum, as millions of the people that have now been dispersed through our country are doing, that we'd ask you to wait in Mexico while we schedule your hearing to consider your application. That, combined with Title 42 that allowed us to return illegal immigrants back across the border, literally ended illegal immigration and asylum abuse. Joe Biden undid all of that and sent a signal south of the border that our borders are open and that an avalanche of humanity, the largest example of human trafficking in human history, is taking place. The cartels charge about $5,000 American to haul people up, often abusing people on the way, particularly, I say, the heavy heart, young women and the elderly, and arriving at the border and shoving them across. But under this administration, the situation's only going to get worse. I mean, I actually heard the current Vice President, Kamala Harris, say that they'd improve the situation, but it gets worse and gets better like the weather. No, it's not like the weather. We can control our southern border. A nation without borders is not a nation. We prove that you can control the southern border. So I will tell you that day one of any administration that I lead, we'll restart construction of the wall. We'll put Remain in Mexico back into effect, Title 42 back into effect, and we will expedite the asylum applications of these millions of people, hundreds of thousands of which have been sent to Chicago, to New York, to major cities around the country. And we'll process those people. Now, where people literally have a legitimate claim for asylum, we have laws that consider that. But other people, if it's denied, they go home. But this is an extraordinary crisis, and the American people deserve to know it is 100% at the feet of Joe Biden. It's one more reason why we need new leadership in the White House.
Colin, you talked a lot about, and you asked about the southern border, but you talked a lot about what was happening in Chicago here. Where in Chicago do you live? Describe to us what it's like for you, how it's changed.
Sure. Well, I live on the north side, and you could just walk down the street. People living in doorways, putting up tents in public parks, massive tents. And now our mayor is proposing tent cities because there's just so many here now.
Hard to imagine how 10 cities would work out in the winter in Chicago, but
Weatherized.
Yeah. So, Mr. Vice President, this is you've talked about closing the southern border. You've got sanctuary mayors, sanctuary states around the country now where what's happening in Chicago is being replicated. How, on a federal level, do you deal with the situation that has now been created in these cities?
Well, you defund sanctuary cities, first and
What does that
foremost.
mean, though?
Well, that means you say to cities like New York and like Chicago and other cities that at least said they were sanctuary cities, and still they were turned into sanctuaries, right? I mean, I don't know what the new mayor of Chicago is saying about it, but I actually commended Mayor Eric Adams in New York because he finally was calling out the Biden administration and saying, this is a threat to our city, it's a threat to the safety in our city, it's a threat to our economy. And then when I praised him for it at a press conference, he blamed the Trump administration. Again, we had secured the southern border. This whole crisis began when Joe Biden literally undid every policy that we put into effect. But look, I think you use the power of the purse, federal government, and say that we're going to defund sanctuary cities around the country until they dismantle this sanctuary city criteria, and so that they're not magnets for attracting illegal immigration into the country. And then at the end of the day, as I said, you need to expedite the process of these people that are brought in to the country. But I also want to say one other thing, and that is that, look, we have a broken immigration system in this country, all right? We have a broken border, but we also have a broken immigration system. And when my grandfather came to this country in 1923, he stepped off a boat onto Ellis Island. Richard Michael Cawley came here to work, and he came here to be an American. And that was how Michael Richard Pence got his name and got to be Vice President of the United States. Our families live that American dream, but that dream doesn't work for people anymore. Now we have this incoherent system of chain migration that's largely based on families. If I'm President of the United States, Leland, I'm going to go to the American people, I'm going to go to the Congress and say we need a merit-based immigration system in this country that literally says, what are the needs in the economy here in Illinois? What are the needs of the economy in Indiana, in Iowa, and everywhere around America? And then open the doors of our country to people to come in legally that want to come here and work in those professions, in the city and on the farm that we need them to work. That's what a merit-based immigration system is, and frankly, it's what it was. When my grandfather came here, he had to get a credential in a certain profession because there was a quota for people in certain professions to be admitted through Ellis Island. We got to get back to that idea and start putting the interest of America first, but have an immigration system that works for a growing American economy.
And certainly, as we've seen about how many jobs are needed to be filled in America, that's an important point. You brought up earlier in the town hall the divide in the Republican Party over Ukraine, which is interesting. And we are now hearing some Republicans sound a lot like Neville Chamberlain did in the 1930s. Kevin, who's a communications specialist, he lives in Iowa, has a question for you about Ukraine.
Good evening, Vice President
Hi,
Pence. President Trump says he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours if he was elected president once again. What would you do to end the war in Ukraine?
Well, the only way you can end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours is by letting Putin have everything he wants. Look, I've met Vladimir Putin. For the last 20 years, he's been very clear that his ambition is to reclaim the old Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Now, let me be clear. I think, Kevin, I think Joe Biden has done a terrible job explaining what our national interest is in providing military support to the Ukrainian military. He gives these gauzy speeches about democracy that, for all the world, sound like campaign speeches. I believe our national interest there is that I am convinced that if the Ukrainian military doesn't stop and repel that Russian invasion, it's not going to be too long before that Russian army crosses a border that our men and women in uniform are going to have to go and fight under our NATO treaty. I truly believe it, whether that's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, whether it's Baltic. or Poland, I don't know. But we had this idea called the Reagan Doctrine, which was, back in the day, we said, if you're willing to fight the communists in your country, we'll give you the means to fight them there so we don't have to fight them. That's our national interest there. Look, it's a humanitarian crisis. I visited Ukraine. I will tell you, the war crimes that have taken place there, the unconscionable brutality of the Russian military speaks for itself. But I believe the reason why we need to give the Ukrainian military what they need, and not in the dribs and drabs the Biden administration has done, but give them the resources that they need to fight and to win and to drive that Russian military back, is because it's in our interest, and I think ultimately it's in the interest of peace and security in the world. Lastly, I will tell you this: if Putin somehow wins either all or part of what he wants in Ukraine, I think that's going to embolden China's military ambitions in the Asia Pacific. But you achieve peace through strength, and by using what amounts to 3% of our national defense budget, as we have so far, to support the Ukrainian military, let them push back the Russians. I think that'll discourage China from its military ambitions in the Asia Pacific, especially with regard to Taiwan. That's how we achieve a more peaceful future, and that's what it means to be the leader of the free world.
Why do you think, sir, there are so many Republicans, both Republican primary voters and by extension, or maybe by leadership, so many of the other candidates in the primary, so willing to turn their back on the Ukrainians?
Well, I think that disastrous...
Isolationist? What is it?
No, I think his lack of confidence in Joe Biden as a commander-in-chief. I mean, look, that disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan should never have happened. And it's emboldened the enemies of freedom around the world. And I frankly think it's understandable that Republicans, independents, and many Democrats hear Joe Biden say, now this is what else we should be doing, and we question that. I get it, particularly with the terribly ineffective way that he's described our interests there. But I will tell you that from all of my experience as your vice president, traveling the world, meeting many of these world leaders, being out there with our military, having some of the military in our immediate family, and my years on the International Relations Committee, I think this is a very perilous time on the world stage. It's no time for on-the-job training. The next president of the United States is going to have to be able to deal with these world leaders. It's going to require, first, we're going to build up our military to make sure the strongest military in the history of the world is stronger than ever before. And then we're going to have to send a very clear message to these authoritarian regimes that the United States is going to defend our country, and we're going to defend our interests around the world. That's what we mean by peace through strength. And I believe that that will be supported by the broad majority, not just of Republicans, but independents and Democrats around the country as well.
One issue is, Kevin pointed out, that you are at odds with your former boss, former running mate on. Marco, who's a manager here in Chicago, has a question about your relationship with former President Trump.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you.
You've spoken at length about how you disagree with Trump on the Ukraine situation, and you've spoken a lot on that. And I'm more interested in your points of differentiation with the former president on domestic policy, particularly when you were the vice president. Or, I haven't had the benefit of reading your book, and you might plug that. I don't know. But
I recommend you do.
Yeah, I'm curious. Like, were there moments that you can speak to now that, like, no, we should not have done that? And I think because a lot of people trust Trump, that he's actually going to stand up for them and fight for them. If we can kind of see where he didn't stand up for them, like that might help, right? But I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Well, first, let me say, one of the things I've realized since I left office is that I'm well known, but I'm not known well. Most people know me as that loyal vice president standing alongside the president. I thought my job was always to be prepared, to be informed, to be of service whenever called into service, but not to be the story. We don't elect co-presidents in this country. So anytime I had a difference of opinion with President Trump, I shared it with him in private, which is, I think, what a vice president owes to a president. And I shared some of those things in my book, and I recount those. One of them is about Afghanistan. mean, the president was intent on pulling all of our troops out of Afghanistan. Our military commanders, though, recommended that we leave a couple of thousand troops there, just like we have in Syria, just to maintain what they called a counterterrorism operation, so that in the event the terrorist elements emerged, that we would be able to hit them before we have another day like we had 22 years ago this week. I made it clear that I thought that that was a prudent course. And the part of me thinks that we would eventually gotten there. But President Trump very much wanted all of the troops out. And when Joe Biden came in, I'm confident our military commanders told him the same thing. But in his case, he pulled all the troops out. And we all saw the disaster that followed, including the loss of 13 brave American service members, including a young Hoosier Marine named Humberto Sanchez. He was at the Abbey Gate in Afghanistan at the Kabul airport. He heard over his radio that somebody had gotten past the wire that looked like they meant harm. And as I learned when Karen and I went to his funeral in Logansport, Indiana, just one Marine family to another, his mom told me and his fellow Marines told me that when he got the order to pull back, Humberto Sanchez refused, because he radioed back that everybody in my line are all women and children. I got to get them through. And he took the brunt of the blast. I mean, the truth is, if we'd had a modicum of troops there, I don't believe the Taliban would have ever moved. And Afghanistan would be a very different place today. And that was a difference that we had. But when I hear now the former president, and frankly, a number of others in this contest that are saying that we got to choose between solving problems here at home and being the leader of the free world, I think that's a false choice. I mean, look, I want to be clear with you. I've been at this a while, all right? We can make our streets safe. We can secure our border. We can revive our economy. We can unleash American energy. We can solve the problems facing American families and be the leader of the free world. And anybody that thinks different's got a pretty small view of the greatest nation on earth. And I promise you, as your president, we'll do both. And America will be more prosperous and secure as a result.
All right, Mr. Vice President, this brings us to our lightning round. So we'd appreciate 1-2-word answers just as we go through this. We did a lot of research ahead of this, looked way back in the archives of Mike Pence. We'd be interested to see what we found.
Last week, Indiana Democrats selected the O'Bannon team. And this week, here at the state Republican convention, delegates selected the Goldsmith team. But how will the two compare? Join us as we rate the matchups. It's O'Bannon versus Goldsmith tonight on The Mike Pence Show.
Do you remember who won?
I do. I was in your line of work for a while.
You got any critiques? You got like 10 seconds.
No, I was never as good as you. I never would have made it on NewsNation, but it's an honor to be here tonight.
All right, here we go for the lightning round. Best Indiana sports movie, Rudy, Hoosiers Are Breaking Away.
Got to be Hoosiers.
All right. Did you ever get briefed on UFOs?
Yes.
Are they real?
Let me just say it doesn't exist, but I've been to Area 51, and I didn't meet anybody that wasn't from around here.
Okay. All right. There's the answer. Best piece of advice Joe Biden gave you about being vice president?
Well, he did give me some advice, and it was stay close to the president, build that relationship. I mean, I will tell you, for all the faults of the Obama-Biden years, they had a good working relationship. And I will tell you, it didn't end the way I wanted it to, but I'm very proud of the relationship that I had with President Trump during our 4 years. And I believe that relationship contributed to the extraordinary accomplishments of our administration. I'll always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration.
Right now, there is a media obsession about Tim Scott's status as a bachelor. I don't know if you read the Washington Post story.
No.
Should that matter as running for president?
No.
Okay. Most important thing you told Kamala Harris?
I called her up when she was selected to be Joe Biden's running mate. I congratulated her, and I told her we'd pray for her.
All right.
And we have.
We have been told reliable sources say, many people say, that you do a very impressive impression of Bill Clinton. The floor is yours.
Bill Clinton?
You got a better one?
Well, I talk like George Bush a little bit, but I don't talk like Bill Clinton.
All right. As a reminder, at the start of the evening, we asked.
I was with him for 8 years.
Very good. As a reminder, at the start of the evening, we asked how many of you were undecided on who you would support in the Republican primary. Show of hands tonight, both here and in Iowa. Who is more likely to vote for Mr. Pence because of what you heard this evening? All right, well, you got a couple in Iowa and a couple of hands that are just somewhat raised. We'll let you get back to the campaign trail. We thank you for being with us. Obviously, we thank our audiences both here and in Chicago. In Iowa, conversation continues on social media using the hashtag #PenceTownHall. We're going to see you on the campaign trail. My friend Blake Berman is standing by to critique both of us. He'll have some thoughts on this. And with that, good night. Thanks for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to subscribe. Click the red button to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.